All right. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining. I'm Brendan McEwen. I'm, excuse me, Director of Electric Mobility and Low Carbon Strategies at AES Engineering. AES is predominantly an electrical engineering firm. We specialize particularly in the design of electrical systems for electric transportation and low carbon strategies more broadly. I myself am not an electrical engineer. My background's in policy and planning, and it's great to get to learn from and work with all the leading engineers at AES. We've got offices in Vancouver, Victoria, and Calgary, and serve as electrical designers across Western Canada, as well as policymakers across Canada and really across North America. So what I was hoping to touch on today are two things broadly. Firstly, review some key trends in transportation and energy, and explain why we strongly feel that the future of transportation is electric. And then speak a little bit about how to prepare parking in a range of different sorts of contexts for electric vehicles. So whether you're managing street parking or managing parkades, what are ways that parking authorities can work to support adoption of electric vehicles? So there's these three broad revolutions in transportation that are going on right now. We're going to focus mainly on the implications of the revolution towards electric transportation. But just also wanted to note at the outset, there's also this move towards increasing autonomy of vehicles. So more advanced driver assistance types of functions. And then perhaps in the not too distant future, self-driving cars becoming a commercially viable sort of product that's out there on the market. And the advent of robo-taxi services that within the next decade, we might see start hitting the streets in Canadian cities, and I think has profound implications for the way we use parking in our communities. And then there's also this move towards more shared mobility types of platforms. So ride-hailing services like Uber and Lyft, car sharing, the sharing of electric bikes or scooters, and a whole range of other ways that we're increasingly sharing our transportation assets. And what do we mean when we say electric transportation, electric mobility? I'd propose we're predominantly talking about plug-in electric vehicles. So either pure battery electric vehicles where they're powered solely by an external source of electricity that they can plug into, or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that can plug into an external source of electricity to charge a battery, but can also use gasoline as an alternative source of fuel. There's of course also hybrid electric vehicles that don't plug in, they just have a battery to make that gasoline drive more efficient. And then fuel cell electric vehicles are out there as well. Fuel cells would use a hydrogen fuel cell to provide power to move the vehicle forward. So you might see some talk of these types of vehicles. They are in a much earlier stage of deployment than plug-in electric vehicles. I think for a variety of reasons, they're likely to serve just niche sort of applications in the future. So potentially long-haul trucking, but they are going to have a lot less efficient drivetrains and more expensive technology. It's a lot less likely that we're going to see many of these sorts of vehicles for passenger vehicles than we would these plug-in electric vehicles on the left. So for that reason, we'll focus primarily on those battery electric and plug-in hybrids. And just to cover what we mean when we say electric mobility, for most of this talk, I'll be speaking about private light-duty personal vehicles that are plug-in electric. But it's also important to recognize that we're seeing electrification of a whole range of different types of transportation platforms. So trucks and buses are starting to move to be electric quite rapidly. We're seeing huge amounts of new models being announced. We've got these different sorts of shared mobility platforms I was mentioning earlier, different car share platforms and passenger directed vehicles that have really kind of significant differences despite the vehicles looking similar in terms of who owns those vehicles, where they're parked and how they're going to charge, what's going to be their sort of charging patterns. And those are important for parking authorities to think about. And then we're also seeing electrification enable adoption of electric bicycles and other sorts of micromobility platforms like scooters and single wheels, cargo bikes. and that electric drive enabling people to make greater use of those sorts of little vehicles, and that can be important to sustainability and also an interesting thing to think about. How can we accommodate that in how we use parking? And lastly, the move towards off-road electric equipment. So construction equipment, farm equipment, boats, trains, those are all part of this broad suite of electric mobility, and we're seeing rapid development of electric models for all these vehicle types. So I want to say a little bit as context about some of the key trends we see in energy. Firstly, Canada has adopted greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets that are aligned with the science of where we need to go if we're going to have a relatively safe and habitable planet into the future. So 30% reductions below 2005 levels by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And there's a whole range of different sorts of actions that the federal government, provinces, and local governments are taking to pursue those types of targets, of course. Notably, Canada has adopted targets that 30% of passenger vehicles be zero emissions, so predominantly plug-in electric by 2030 and 100% by 2040. And we actually have these legislated targets in British Columbia and Quebec already. And there is increasing conversation about similar sorts of regulations that would impose this as a requirement on manufacturers at a national scale. It's also important to recognize that Canada has very low greenhouse gas intensity electricity, and that greenhouse gas intensity, the level of pollution that comes from our electricity, is declining. So the amount of CO2 that's been released by the electrical sector has approximately halved over the last 20 years. And you can see that most of the emissions that come from Canada's electrical sector are from coal. We have committed to phasing out coal-fired power by 2030. And that's actually proceeding just purely due to economic forces faster than scheduled. So we're moving towards all jurisdictions in Canada having, all provinces having quite low carbon intensity power, even though in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia right now, we still have relatively GHG intensive power. We're moving towards an environment where most provinces have fairly low GHG power. Now, a big driver of this, in addition to policy commitments, is that renewable electricity costs are falling dramatically. So this shows the cost in terms of $1 per megawatt hour value of where solar energy and wind have gone in the past 10 years or so, and their projections into the future. And what we're finding is that there's actually bids in competitive power markets like Alberta's, where the cost to implement renewables are coming in significantly lower than building, let's say, new natural gas-fired power or new coal-fired power. So not only is it the cleanest, but also increasingly the lowest cost energy is very low carbon renewable energy. So that's important when we think about the development of electric mobility and how that's going to be helping environmental outcomes. So I'll speak a little bit about what the various benefits of moving towards electric transportation systems are. Firstly, electric transportation has much lower life cycle GHG emissions than comparable vehicles that use internal combustion engines, so gasoline and diesel types of vehicles, or even compressed natural gas. So this is a map given the different greenhouse gas intensity of different provinces as well as regions in the US of what the decline in life cycle GHG emissions is from moving towards electric passenger vehicles versus gasoline and diesel vehicles. I'll note this is for the 2017 grid GHG intensity. So in a lot of these jurisdictions, the story is already better, and it's going to be increasingly improved into the future. But even assuming that you were just to be sticking at 2017 levels of how carbon intensive your electric grid is, when you look at the full life cycle of vehicles manufacturing, including the battery manufacturing, their use, given typical amounts that households in Canada and North America drive, and then their disposal, EVs in most Canadian provinces achieve greater than an 80% emissions reduction. Now that's going to further decline as the grid gets cleaner and also as battery manufacturing cleans up. But even in areas where we use a fairly significant amount of coal-fired power still, as well as natural gas, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, we're seeing probably about a 30% to 50% in Nova Scotia decline in GHG emissions now. So there's this real carbon benefit to supporting the adoption of EVs that's only going to increase with time. There are also zero emissions at the tailpipe. So every year in Canada, about 1,500 people pass away, die from tailpipe-related emissions. And many, many more, of course, get sick with various sort of cardiovascular types of ailments. The attribution of that is about 1/3 passenger vehicles, 1/3 trucking, goods movement, and 1/3 urban construction equipment. So as we move towards electrification of all those different sectors, we've got this opportunity to really decrease the health burden that Canadians are facing and that everyone around the world is facing. I note this is particularly a concern for those that work in the parking industry. In terms of benefits for the drivers, EVs have much lower fuel costs. So this is a comparison of the typical cost to fuel an internal combustion engine vehicle in the dark green versus a battery electric vehicle in the light green in different provinces based on electricity costs, fuel costs, and also how far households tend to drive in these areas. So you see that typically EVs are about 20% or less of the cost of an internal combustion vehicle when you're charging at home. Now, there's going to be opportunities for people who charge in a workplace context or in public parking areas to potentially even have lower costs for fueling, because the way electricity rates for residential contexts are structured is different than commercial types of contexts. There's ways to provide your charging where you can effectively charge even less or have lower costs per kilowatt hour. So the benefits can even be more substantial than that. EVs also have lower maintenance costs. So this is data reported recently by Consumer Reports that looks over the first 200,000 miles of the lifetime of these vehicles, and EVs are coming in at about half the cost per distance traveled as internal combustion vehicles on average. Also, reduce noise pollution. So at urban speeds, EVs are going to be quieter than internal combustion vehicles. Once you get up to highway speeds, it's more dominated by the aerodynamic effects of the vehicles. But in the context where noise pollution is really, one of the greatest issues in urban environments, EVs are a lot quieter. Definitely, a benefit when it comes to passenger vehicles, although it's the greatest benefit for things like diesel trucks and buses that can be the most noisy in urban spaces. And then just switching gears to some of the benefits that accrue by the electrification of bicycles and other forms of micromobility. Adding an electrical drive to complement human power in the terms of pedaling or just other forms of these low-speed vehicles really does allow us to make better use of these types of vehicles. So there's been a fair bit of study of these sorts of effects just in the last couple of years. What we're consistently finding is that people, once they get a new e-bike versus a new sort of pedal bicycle, they're willing to travel further. So on average, take as their maximum trip distance 2 times longer of a trip by bicycle. And they'll also take more of their trips by bikes. Reasons for that are that hills become not a barrier. So in our hilly cities, you're not going to be dissuaded from choosing to bike because it's just as easy to pedal uphill as it is to go on the flat or downhill. There's potential for weather to be less of a barrier. So fat tire bikes can maneuver in the snow easier. And so winter commuting by bike becomes more of an opportunity. Also, there's potential even for covered little vehicles that can protect you from the snow and rain and cold. And people can carry heavier loads on these sorts of vehicles. So child transport, grocery shopping, some of these cargo bikes are able to carry up to 700 pounds worth of cargo. So even for urban delivery applications, they become quite viable. I'll speak a little bit about the trends that we're seeing in the EV space. So currently across Canada, EVs make up a little bit less than 4% of all the electric vehicle sales in the country. In leading jurisdictions like BC, that's closer to 10%. That's been staying about level for the last year or so, but they're kind of weathering the COVID storm. We're expecting the share of new vehicle sales to really increase rapidly into the future. And that's because the costs of batteries are declining. So since around 2010 to the present day, we've gone from about $1,200 a kilowatt hour for batteries down to, I believe this last year, the best estimate was around $135 a kilowatt hour. And what's happening here is there's learning by doing, there's economies of scale, and every time the manufacturing capacity of batteries increases, we build a new plant, those manufacturers are learning how to manufacture in more efficient ways. And we're seeing for each doubling of that manufacturing capacity, a 18% learning rate, so an 18% decline in costs. So what that means is by about 2024, we'd see less than $100 a kilowatt hour for batteries in terms of industry weighted averages. And by 2030, maybe around $60 a kilowatt hour. To put this in context, these are sort of industry averages. Tesla's claiming that in the next 3 years, they're going to get down to that 2030 level of about $60 a kilowatt hour, again, in the next 3 years, so maybe before 2024. And these types of price declines fundamentally change the economics of producing EVs. So what this graphic shows is from the International Council on Clean Transportation. I'd note that there's kind of broad agreement amongst those that look into this space about these general trends. And what it shows is this declining cost to produce and then presumably purchase the vehicles for manufacturers as you go over time. So these three lines sloping downwards are a battery electric vehicle with 250 miles of all electric range, 200 miles, and 150 miles. And basically sometime between 2024 and 2026, all these vehicles become the same price to produce and subsequently lower price on a first cost basis than conventional internal combustion vehicles. So basically in the next 5 years, you're looking at a vehicle that is the same and then subsequently lower price to produce and presumably purchase, has much lower operating costs, really is a better driving experience in a lot of ways, better handling, increasingly looks like will last a lot longer than internal combustion vehicles, and of course have lower maintenance costs, and has all these benefits of being zero emissions. It's difficult to understand why people are going to want to keep adopting conventional gasoline or diesel vehicles if they can get something that'll be lower cost upfront and on a life cycle basis and have all these other sorts of benefits. The last thing I'll note is that plug-in hybrids, that top pink line, don't decline at the same rate. And that's because they've got smaller batteries and also need to have that gasoline drivetrain still within the vehicle. So we don't expect those sorts of cost declines for plug-in hybrids. But here, within the next 5 years, potentially the only thing that's going to be keeping households from adopting EVs as their next vehicle is whether or not they've got a convenient place to charge. And that's where parking authorities can really play an important role in this transition and also have a real important opportunity to, I guess, improve their own economic performance. And I'll just note that when EVs cost the same as internal combustion vehicles, we've got proof from leading jurisdictions like Norway that have substantial sales taxes on vehicles that they waive for EVs so that those first costs are equivalent today between EVs and internal combustion vehicles. We see them come to dominate sales. So Norway, again, there's equivalent costs, and they've gone from basically no EVs being sold around 7 years ago to 80% of the market in October being plug-in electric vehicles, about 60% battery electric and about a little under 20% being plug-in hybrid. So households tend to want these vehicles. There's also an important policy driver to all this as well. So we've got multiple jurisdictions across the world having announced and many legislated phase-out targets or requirements for fossil fuel vehicles. So California recently announced it would be making requirements that all new vehicles sold after 2035 would need to be zero emissions. We've seen similar sorts of requirements between 2025 and 2035 in European countries, and announced targets in the largest auto markets in the world in terms of India and China. China does have legislated targets for 60% of all sales to be 2035. So there's this policy push that's also going to be driving all the manufacturers to be focusing all of their new vehicle development on electric drivetrains, and that's going to speed this transition as well. So I want to turn now to the need to support access to EV charging, because as I said, access to EV charging is turning into the most important factor that's going to determine whether or not households and other sorts of vehicle owners are going to be adopting EVs. So just in terms of a bit of nomenclature, there's broadly 3 different levels of EV charging. The first is level 1, which is basically the same voltage as a wall outlet, 120 volts. It provides a relatively slow rate of charge, but a lot of households can make do with this just fine in terms of their own household charging, and it can play an important role in applications where a slow rate of charging is okay, let's say at airport parking or some workplaces and other sorts of opportunities. So there's the opportunity either to plug directly into a dedicated household outlet, or there's interesting sort of platforms like Plugzio that can allow you to charge for the use of power and just let households use their charging adapter that comes with every vehicle. We also see a lot of demand for level 2 charging for home, workplace, and also some on-the-go charging. So that's a 208 volt or 240 volt circuit, anywhere between, I guess, 16 amps and 80 amps. And it can provide a faster rate of charge. So maybe approximately 20 kilometers per hour at the low end to 100 kilometers plus at the higher end there. The most common amperages would be 32 or 40 amps, and that's around 40 or 50 kilometers an hour worth of charge when you're getting the full capacity of that circuit. And then lastly, we have DC fast charging. DC fast charging is usually just in publicly accessible charging applications for passenger vehicles. And depending on the amperage and the power that's provided here, you go anywhere between fast and really, really fast. So maybe 200 kilometers per hour of electricity added, 200 kilometers of range added to the vehicle, up to perhaps 2,000 or more at the very highest end. In terms of where we charge, the vast majority of charging happens at home, and access to at-home charging is really critical to households feeling comfortable with adopting EVs. About 75% of all the charging occurs at home. It's either usually level 1 or level 2. Now, in single-family homes with their own on-site garage or a parking pad, it's usually, although not always, fairly straightforward to provide a circuit for EV charging and not that costly. This can be quite a bit more complicated in multifamily buildings that haven't been future-proofed to be EV ready, involving more complicated and expensive retrofits. So I'll say a little bit more about that momentarily. Now, workplace charging is also a really important complement for home charging. Probably about little under 20% of all the charging that happens in Canada right now takes place at work. Likewise, anywhere we've got fleets regularly parked or domiciled, that's the obvious place to provide charging for them. And then a relatively small but important amount of all the charging that takes place is on the go. So either so-called destination charging. So let's say at a grocery store or a public facility, maybe close to shopping, where people are going to be parked for relatively short periods of time. You might have publicly accessible charging. And depending on how long those vehicles will be parked there, either level 2 with relatively high amperage or even DC fast charging makes sense in those contexts. And then when you're building networks to allow people to go on longer trips between urban centers, along highways, you're looking at faster rates of DC fast charging at the very tip of the pyramid there. I'll say a little bit about EV energy management systems, because EV energy management systems are an extremely important technology to have sort of a working understanding of, that can enable much higher rates of charging to be provided in terms of the number of parking spaces in a facility where charging is provided in a cost-effective manner. So EV energy management basically involves charging stations that have a degree of intelligence. And the idea is that if one vehicle here on this electrical circuit is plugged in and only it is charging, it can take the full capacity of that electrical circuit and charge at a relatively fast rate. But if multiple vehicles are plugged in and charging at the same time, the charging stations can communicate across some sort of network. So potentially a cellular connection or wireless cable, communications cable on the wall, any sort of network, and throttle down so that their capacity isn't going to exceed the capacity of some circuit and blow the breaker. And so when they're throttled down, they will be charging at a slower rate, but in a lot of applications, that's just fine. And everyone's still going to be receiving a good quality of service and be able to be fully charged or get a reasonable recharge by the time they're moving their vehicle. So the value of this is kind of demonstrated in this schematic here. So if you were to do EV charging sort of the old-fashioned way without any energy management controls, let's say if you were to provide 4 charging stations, you would have 4, in this case, 40 amp circuits going to serve those charging stations, and that requires 160 amps worth of capacity in that building. Whereas if you do load sharing, in this case, 4-way sharing across a circuit, you have a lot lower electrical capacity required, so 40 amps. And when you multiply this out over larger facilities, it can become a lot more cost effective to provide for multiple parking spaces with EV charging, because they are going to require a smaller electrical system and lower costs for that electrical system. So there's different ways of doing EV energy management. A common way is load sharing, where you're just sharing across a branch circuit, and you've got more than one charging station sharing that branch circuit. You can also do control at a panel and overload the panel. And there's even service monitoring systems. So here you'd be monitoring how much power is coming off the main transformer for a building in real time. And whenever there's spare capacity in that building, allocating additional capacity to charging stations. EVSE is EV supply equipment, that are another word for charging stations, that are downstream in the electrical system. So you can make best use of what spare capacity exists in those facilities. So that's kind of demonstrated in this diagram, where if you're using service monitoring, you can use all that space between the building's actual real-time electrical demand and either the building capacity or some other higher limit that the building sets. So the value of this is when you're designing and future-proofing a lot of stalls to ultimately have EV charging, you can have significantly lower costs when you're using EV energy management. So this is just sort of illustrative of these dynamics, some costing that we did for Fortis BC, where if you're just providing the outlet to ultimately provide EV charging, so not the charging station itself, but if you were to do a new facility that would have dedicated 40 amp circuits to each parking stall, all that electrical equipment and capacity would cost almost $2,500 per stall for that building. Whereas if you were to go with a simple sort of four-way sharing system on a 40 amp circuit, or four-way sharing with service monitoring, you can significantly lower the cost of providing those outlets. And then you're just incrementally adding charging stations over time in a simple process to provide for charging access at those stalls. So that's all sort of background in terms of some of the key trends and technologies that we see impacting the EV charging space. I wanted to switch to discussing what are some of the key opportunities for parking authorities. So I've got 3 bullets here with some points underneath them as what we see as key opportunities. Firstly, for those parking authorities that are part of local governments, there's I think options to encourage your city planning and sustainability departments to adopt EV-ready requirements for new developments to ensure that households as well as places like workplace have access to EV-ready parking. So I'll say a little bit more momentarily about the value in having 100% EV-ready residential parking in new developments, as well as EV-ready commercial and institutional parking, probably in lesser percentages, maybe depends on the nature of the parking use, but anywhere from 10 to 40% of the parking in new developments for different non-residential applications can make good sense to be EV-ready. Secondly, many of you are, of course, operating parking facilities, and we'd encourage you to take sort of a holistic, comprehensive approach to planning out the implementation of EV charging, not just for the first couple of charging stations that you're implementing, but ultimately for a decade or 2 into the future, the full population of EVs that are likely to be using those facilities, and consider the range of different types of applications for how that parking would be used. Personal vehicles, potentially also think about how do you accommodate e-bikes and other forms of micromobility, and then things like car share and ride hailing or future robotaxi services that are going to probably require relatively faster rates of charging. And lastly, also wanted to discuss just a couple of innovative policies that can be used by cities, including parking authorities, to encourage EV adoption. So I make, firstly, new construction 100% EV ready for residential parking. We've seen really significant uptake of these sorts of requirements amongst Canadian municipalities, particularly in British Columbia, although we're in discussions with a number of cities across the country. Would also note that City of Toronto has requirements that all new residential parking be EV ready, so have an outlet that you can install a charging station at in the future. And as I mentioned, 17 communities in BC. So what do we mean by EV ready? Basically, it's having an energized outlet, so a source of electricity that's on a branch circuit where you can then install in the future the charging station. So it's not the charging station itself, but it's all the electrical equipment necessary to implement that charging station in all your parking spaces. And so an energized outlet is just a junction box on the wall or a receptacle to provide charging. And as I mentioned, when you're doing this in new construction and you use EV energy management, it can be actually quite cost effective to provide for that sort of future proofing for EV charging. So again, here with that sort of 4-way load sharing option, which is fairly readily implementable, cost of about $670 in this case to make all parking spaces in a new residence EV ready. So you compare that to the cost of new structural parking, and it's relatively minor to provide a significant benefit to the end user and a lot lower cost than providing retrofits to those facilities later on. So part of the way these requirements work is that local governments set maximum amounts of load sharing using EV energy management that you can do. And we're seeing this done through these types of tables. So basically, it's say for any given circuit breaker amperage, what's the maximum amount of sharing that you can do on this circuit? So 4-way on a 40 amp circuit, for instance, is very sort of reasonable. These other levels are reasonable for this particular case, the city of Victoria, but higher levels of sharing might be problematic Now, what's going to be the appropriate charging performance in different communities will vary. So if you're in a more suburban location where people tend to drive further, they spend more on gasoline regularly, they're also going to require more electricity service. So you can get away with relatively less load management and power sharing in places where people are driving much further distances versus in city centers where they drive less. So we have helped multiple municipalities understand what are the appropriate performance requirements for their particular jurisdictions. So we very much encourage new developments to be made EV ready, particularly residential buildings. We also think there's value in conducting EV ready retrofits to existing facilities. So you'd want to implement these sorts of retrofits to a whole range of different types of parking applications, residential parking, workplace, and destination and on-the-go charging. So some of these types of parking facilities, your parking authorities might manage directly. Some might be other members in the community. The reason you'd want to provide sort of access to charging in these scenarios is as follows. For residential, I emphasize how important it is to support home charging. And we're also now seeing this emerge as something that's important to add value to the property to ensure that future residents are going to be able to charge at those spaces, even if you as let's say a condominium owner aren't thinking about buying an EV in the next couple of years. Having that EV ready parking space will support increased value to your property. For workplace parking, providing access to EV charging is increasingly important to attracting and retaining tenants. It's something that talented employees want to see. It's a great opportunity to demonstrate leadership in the community and again, increase property values. And there's also an opportunity here to increase parking revenues. So as I'll note momentarily, there's a variety of ways that you can charge for access to charging services. So have user fees for the ability to charge vehicles. And there's even an argument to be made in some jurisdictions that encouraging households employees to be adopting EVs can assist with productivity because they're going to have access to HOV lanes. So for all these reasons, having access to workplace charging is important. The last thing I'd note is that people who have access to workplace charging tend to be actually 6 times more likely to adopt an EV as those that don't. So it can be really this important catalyst to get people thinking about and feeling like they're enabled to choose to go electric. And lastly, providing charging close to shopping centers, other types of amenities is important to generating increased retail traffic. Again, there's going to be opportunities to generate revenue, and there can be a positive business case. And in terms of providing not just level 2, but DC fast charging, that can support people who are driving on long distance trips, and also have a provision for charging that can be more convenient for them if they don't have access to home or workplace charging. If you're thinking about DC fast charging at a facility that's close to amenities they visit regularly. So what we're finding working with some leading buildings in having EV ready parking in residential as well as sort of commercial contexts is you can actually design for high levels of EV readiness in existing buildings relatively cost effectively. So in this, just an example of one building we've worked with, we found a cost of $1,500 per parking space to make all those residential parking spaces EV ready. Many residential buildings we're working with, we're actually finding lower costs than that. It's possible to get it significantly lower, depending again on the performance requirements that you're implementing and the unique needs that we find in each individual building. But I'd emphasize that this can be actually relatively quite cost effective relative to doing incremental additions of EV charging. Now, you probably don't need 100% in, let's say, places where people are parking for work or near shopping centers, but it is valuable to think from the outset about how might that population of drivers evolve over time, and do we want to allow for 10%, 20% higher amounts in the future. So we can help organizations in projecting what that ultimate population of vehicles might be. And I'll just say what some of the values are in terms of this more comprehensive approach here on the left versus incremental additions of charging stations on the right. So in terms of this more comprehensive approach, we're going to find that it's going to be less costly per parking space, although it will be a larger upfront investment. But basically, you make a comprehensive plan, you decide what levels of power sharing are appropriate, and you can future-proof significant amounts of parking in a relatively cost-effective way, versus incremental additions, just because of the mobilization costs, can be quite expensive. So in the incentive programs experience that we have in operation in British Columbia, we're finding that there's costs of, on average, $7,000 a stall, which is significantly greater than what we find in terms of per parking space costs in these sorts of retrofit contexts. The other advantage of having this high level of future proofing is that once that comprehensive upgrade's been done, there's a really simple, expedient process to implementing EV charging over time after that. You just need to get an electrician in to wire that charging station. Whereas if you're doing these sorts of incremental additions, it can be a much more lengthy process to add those charging stations over time. And that can be actually a real barrier in residential contexts to households adopting the EV if they're going to have to go through some sort of 6-month process to get approvals. For a lot of residential parking types, as well as commercial and a variety of other sorts of contexts, we're finding that we can provide up to 100% of charging, 100% of parking spaces with EV charging when we're designing for use of EV energy management systems. Now, every building's going to vary. There are some buildings where there's more significant electrical constraints, but when you plan from the outset and you have your energy management systems tailored to the unique sort of needs of the drivers in those buildings, you can oftentimes get significant amounts of charging. Whereas when we're doing these incremental additions, typically we're not planning for the implementation of energy management. And so you can wind up using up the available electrical capacity in the building by doing this without management and having dedicated circuits. Again, I noted that there's going to be one comprehensive initiative here where and an opportunity to set your policies in terms of user fees and billing, whereas policies with incremental additions are going to be more ad hoc. And there's an opportunity to increase the value for all occupants. So in terms of the process, we recommend any type of building, whether it be a residence or let's say a parking area, a parking lot that's being managed by a parking authority, a workplace, we sort of recommend the same process. Firstly, determine what are all the use cases now as well as into the future. Are you providing workplace charging? If so, how long are those drivers typically at that parking space? Are you providing destination charging for quicker trips to retail or other sorts of amenities? Is there any residential parking? And then based on that, you determine your charging performance requirements for your unique geography as part of these facility assessments. So you look at both the available electrical capacity, how much power each of those end users is going to need, and based on those two factors, determine the most sort of cost-effective designs using EV energy management or other sorts of strategies. And as part of that facility assessment, we'd encourage you to get a preliminary design and then a cost estimate and make your decisions based on that. And once you've done that initial design phase, then engage EV network service providers that would be providing the hardware and ongoing network charging stations that can accommodate systems like billing and usage tracking and other sorts of functions. Engage in your construction and implement your pricing and usage policies. So key considerations as part of this, of course, mentioned pricing. There's different options that are available. So a lot of authorities opt to make parking free and just have it as a perk that gets people to their area. It is possible to also charge on a per unit of time basis, which is a reasonable proxy for how much energy is being used. In the future, it's likely going to be possible to charge on a kilowatt hour basis. Right now, if you want to be on side of Measurement Canada, which is this federal authority, there are challenges to charging on a straight kilowatt hour basis. Simple sort of explanation for that is that the metering typically is integral to the charging station, and it would be fairly expensive to have utility grade meters associated with each charging station. But Measurement Canada has a rule that says if you're going to charge on a kilowatt hour basis, there needs to be a revenue grade meter. So there's active work right now being done by Measurement Canada to address that issue. And finally, we've seen some places charge on a flat rate. So you could say if you're let's say a driver who commutes to this facility every day, we're going to charge $30 a month. That more than covers our cost of electricity. And then other sorts of usage policies, time limits. In residential context, who's going to pay for EVSE implementation, the charging stations implementation, and who's going to own it. So these are just examples of some of the installations that we've done in facilities. I'll also note that there's great opportunities to partner with fast charging networks. We do a lot of work with Tesla that are keen to have superchargers implemented in high use parking areas. So if there is any interest in that, we can facilitate those conversations. And likewise, there's great opportunities to leverage the existing electrical capacity that's in streetlights, either on street or in surface parking lots. We've pioneered a number of the streetlight charging implementations that have been implemented in Canada. And so this is an opportunity to significantly reduce the costs of getting a source of power to these either on street or surface parking areas. Although you can't do it on all circuits, you really need to assess particular street light networks availability of capacity. So just a couple of closing thoughts. I think there's also a role for parking authorities to support e-bike and micromobility adoption when working with cities. So the way we're going to support adoption of micromobility is definitely increasing investments in active transportation infrastructure. That includes both protected all ages and abilities bike lanes, but also having safe and secure bike storage. These bikes tend to be a bit more expensive than conventional ones. So having more covered and protected bike areas is going to be valuable. And the last thing I'll note is that there's some really interesting policies being forwarded by leading municipalities that involve street parking that are going to be encouraging EV adoption. So for instance, the city of Vancouver just yesterday, as part of their climate emergency action plan, directed staff to adopt permit parking for all on-street parking. And then they'll be charging higher fees for new vehicles. So not for all vehicles, but for new vehicles above a certain cost, maybe $40,000 that aren't electric. So there's going to be this financial incentive built into the city's permit parking regimes to encourage any new vehicle above a certain cost to be electric, and they may reduce that cost into the future. So I'd say there's a great opportunity for cities and for parking authorities that work with them to, or as part of those cities, to drive EV adoption. I'll leave it at there. Thanks so much. Looking forward